So Kathie Lee Gifford just became a wonderful example of how sweatshops operate, because she founds this whole thing. She's against sweatshops. She's a super public face. Everybody thinks she's a really nice person. She comes out with her clothing line. It turns out that they're all deeply embedded in sweatshops. This guy calls her out, uses it as an example to show like how sweatshops are everywhere. But what people's message is that they take away, rather than sweatshops are embedded in every aspect of the system. Look over here, this like famous person that you know, Kathie Lee Gifford, even her stuff is there. What they take away is Kathie Lee Gifford is a phony and she's bad. And she's a terrible human being. And it's the wrong takeaway. It's exactly the wrong takeaway. My best guess is that the apology comes from the guy because he realized that she was quite sincere, that she really did want to do that thing, and she had no idea, because the whole thing is, I mean, think, you have a sense for this, right? You don't start your own clothing brand because you're an amazing designer these days, right? Kathie Lee Gifford did not start her own clothing brand because she was like this genius clothing designer. She was just some super megastar and was like, hey, you know what super megastars do? If they want, they can design their own clothing brand. Let's do that, right? And so she wasn't actually involved in that process, right? She was like picking some colors here and yay, right? And that's like what you would do when you make your gazillion dollars and you want to like put your name on something. That's exactly what you're going to do, but you're not going to be deeply embedded in the process. You're going to hire people who just do this for a living, and then they're going to embroider your name on the clothes, and that'll be your like version of Air Jordans or whatever it is. And when that thing goes south and somebody calls you out and says like, oh, you were supposed to be an ethical company, but it turns out you weren't, or you were supposed to do environmental shoes, but they turn out to be, you know, super polluting, it has really nothing to do with you, right? You're bad and you're the face of the company, and so you go down with it, but it has to do with the system, right? The illusion is that if we take down the next Kathie Lee Gifford, we will solve the problem, and that will not solve the problem. Because there are 100 Kathie Lee Giffords. There's always a new famous person starting a new line of clothing. And they will always, either sincerely or insincerely, end up with sweatshops under their belt. But the problem is not the person. The problem is not the person. The problem is the system. And so I think, just like with that podcast on the media and how we remember some of these media personalities and how we like to think of them as sort of like good and evil morality tales, it doesn't have to do with them as individuals. There's a larger thing at work here. And I think you heard that in the podcast. There was like, you know, why is it that we hear so many stories of women sort of being raked across the coals in the media for these scandals? That's the larger story. It's not about Monica Lewinsky. Oh, what a terrible person, right? It's not about, you know, Lorena Bobbitt. Oh, what an awful human being. It's not about them. And in fact, if you dig into the stories, they're very human people and they're not awful. But they are painted as black and white cartoons, and it allows us then to ignore the real problems that occur within the system. And so those things will just keep happening. There will just be new faces on the same problem.